Billionaire's fiancé kicked the maid. Then the martial arts she thought only existed in legends took over her. Wait, before you scroll away. I need to tell you about the night a housemaid froze an entire ballroom with one move. Nobody, not even she, knew she still remembered. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and which country you belong to. I read every single comment. Tonight's story is one of the most emotional, most unexpected stories I've ever told on this channel, and by the end of it, you're going to look at the people who serve you coffee, clean your rooms, and carry your bags a little differently. I promise you, you will not see this twist coming. Nobody in that ballroom knew her name, and by midnight, none of them would ever forget it. The Ashford Grand Hotel in Manhattan glittered that October evening like something out of a fairy tale nobody working there could afford to live in. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across marble floors polished so bright you could see your own nerves reflected back at you. 300 of New York's wealthiest had gathered for one reason: to celebrate the engagement of Alexander Ashford, heir to the Ashford Hotel empire, to Victoria Lane, a woman whose smile could charm a room and whose eyes, if you looked closely enough, never quite matched it. Sophia Reyes had been on her feet since 4 that morning. She was 26 years old, and she moved through the ballroom the way most of the staff did that night. Quietly, quickly, invisibly. A tray of champagne balanced on one palm, a folded towel over her wrist. Her dark hair pulled back so tight it gave her a permanent headache by our 6. She wore the pale grey housekeeping uniform of the Ashford Grand, a uniform designed to be seen and never noticed, and most nights, that suited her just fine. Nobody asked Sophia where she came from. Nobody asked why a woman with hands so calloused could carry a tray without a single tremor, or why she always stood with her weight low and even, like a woman who had once been taught that a body should never be caught off balance. Nobody asked, because nobody looked. That was the rule of places like this. The rich looked at each other. Everyone else was furniture. She hadn't always been furniture. 6 years ago, in a small apartment above a laundromat in Queens, a man named Miguel Reyes used to wake his daughter before sunrise and walk her down to the alley behind their building, where the concrete was cracked and the only light came from a flickering security lamp. He'd stand across from her, feet planted, hands loose at his sides, and say the same thing every single morning. Again. Slower this time. Speed comes after control, not before it. Miguel Reyes had learned to fight the way some men learn to pray, with total devotion, and for reasons deeper than the fighting itself. He'd trained under a teacher in the Philippines whose lineage stretched back generations, a discipline of silent, economical movement, built not to show off but to end a threat in half a second and walk away like nothing happened. He passed every piece of it down to Sophia, not because he wanted a fighter, but because he wanted a daughter who would never, ever be helpless. She hadn't thrown a real strike in 6 years. Not since the night everything changed. Not since the promise she made to herself in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear, a promise that had nothing to do with fists and everything to do with the guilt she still carried like a second skin. Tonight, Sophia just wanted to get through her shift, collect her paycheck, and get home to her mother and her 12-year-old brother Mateo, who needed a new inhaler this month and a winter coat that actually fit him. That was the whole plan. Serve champagne. Smile when spoken to. Disappear when not. She had no idea that in less than 2 hours, in front of every camera phone in that ballroom, her body was going to remember something her mind had spent 6 years trying to forget, and that the man standing at the center of that party, the groom-to-be himself, was about to recognize a movement he'd seen exactly once before on the worst night of his own life. Across the room, Victoria Lane laughed at something one of her bridesmaids said, tilted her head back just enough to catch the chandelier light, and reached for another glass of champagne from a passing tray. She didn't even look at the woman holding it. That was about to become a very expensive mistake. She didn't know it yet, but Victoria Lane had just marked the one person in that entire ballroom she should never have underestimated. The engagement party had been running for 2 hours, and Victoria was starting to feel the particular high that came from being watched by everyone in a room she considered beneath her, in a dress that cost more than most of the staff would make in a year. She loved nights like this. She loved the way conversations paused when she walked past, the way photographers angled toward her without being asked, the way Alexander's mother, who had never once said a warm word to her, still smiled tight and polite for the cameras. What Victoria didn't love was being ignored, even for a second, and even for a second was exactly how long it took for things to go wrong. She'd asked one of the junior servers, a boy who couldn't have been older than 19, to bring her a specific vintage of champagne, not the one being poured, but the reserve bottle kept behind the bar for VIP tables. The boy, flustered and new, brought the wrong glass twice. On his third attempt, rushing, he clipped the edge of Sophia's tray as she passed behind him, and 3 flutes of champagne tipped sideways. Sophia caught 2 of them out of pure reflex, a fast, controlled twist of her wrist that any bartender would have admired. The third one hit the hem of Victoria's gown. It wasn't much. A small, dark stain against pale blue silk, gone in seconds under the ballroom lights. Most women in that room would have laughed it off, called for a napkin, moved on with their night. Victoria was not most women. Are you serious right now? Her voice cracked across the nearby tables like a whip, sharp enough that 3 separate conversations stopped mid-sentence. She yanked the fabric up, inspecting it like it had been set on fire. Do you know what this dress cost? Do you have any idea? I'm so sorry, Sophia said quietly, already reaching for the towel on her arm, dropping into a crouch to blot at the stain. It was an accident. The tray was clipped. I'll have it cleaned immediately, or the hotel will cover. I don't want it cleaned, Victoria snapped, stepping back so sharply that Sophia's outstretched hand caught only air. I want to know why someone like you is even allowed near the guests without supervision. Someone like you. Sophia had heard versions of that sentence more times than she could count in 6 years of hotel work, and she'd built a wall around herself specifically so it would slide off without leaving a mark. Most nights, it did. She kept her eyes down, her voice even, her hands steady, and repeated the same 3 words she trained herself to say in moments like this: it's not personal. It's not personal. It's not personal. A small crowd had gathered now, the way crowds always do around the smell of someone else's humiliation. A photographer near the bar quietly raised his phone. I'll have the manager comp your dry cleaning, Sophia offered, standing slowly, keeping her posture small, unthreatening, apologetic. A posture she'd practiced without even realizing it, the exact opposite of the way her father had taught her to stand. Weight forward. Shoulders soft. Make yourself smaller than the moment. You'll have the manager fire you, Victoria said, loud enough now that heads were turning from 3 tables away. That's what will actually happen. Do you know who I'm about to marry? Do you understand what this hotel means to my future husband? And you're out here throwing drinks on his guests like this is some diner in Queens. Somewhere behind her, on the other side of the ballroom, deep in conversation with a business partner, Alexander Ashford had no idea any of this was happening. He was 70 feet away, laughing at a joke, completely unaware that the woman he was about to marry was 2 sentences away from doing something that would echo through his life for years. Sophia's jaw tightened, just slightly. Not from anger. From something older. Something closer to memory. Queens, Victoria had said. Like it was an insult. Sophia thought, unbidden, of a cracked alley behind a laundromat, and a man with rough hands and a soft voice, telling her that speed comes after control. I understand you're upset, Sophia said, and her voice, for the first time all night, didn't shake. I really am sorry about your dress. It should have ended there. In almost any other version of this night, it would have. But Victoria Lane had an audience now, and champagne in her blood, and 6 years of being told by everyone around her that people like Sophia existed to be corrected. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and in one sharp, contemptuous motion. The kind of gesture meant to humiliate rather than harm, a petty, ugly kick aimed low, meant to send Sophia stumbling backward in front of everyone. She swung her leg toward Sophia's shin. And something in Sophia Reyes, something dormant for 6 long years, woke up before her mind even had time to decide. The whole ballroom went silent at exactly the same second. not because of what Victoria did, but because of what happened after. Sophia never chose to move. That was the part she would try to explain to herself for weeks afterward, lying awake staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling. There had been no decision, no flash of thought, no moment where she weighed her options and picked one. Her body simply answered a question her mind hadn't been asked in 6 years, and it answered the way 6,000 mornings in a Queen's Alley had taught it to answer. Victoria's foot never landed. Sophia's hand shot out and closed around her ankle mid-swing, gentle as a whisper and immovable as stone, stopping the kick a full 6 inches from contact. It happened in under half a second. No wasted motion, no flourish, nothing that looked rehearsed or dramatic. It looked, to the 300 people watching, like something out of a movie. It looked, to Sophia, like coming home to a house she'd sworn never to enter again. For one full, suspended breath, nobody in that ballroom made a sound. Victoria stood frozen, off balance, one heel hovering in the air, held perfectly still by a maid's bare hand, her face draining from fury to something closer to fear. Around them, phones came up. A dozen, then 2 dozen, small black rectangles rising like a wave, all of them aimed at a housekeeper in a grey uniform who had just done something no one in that room could explain. Sophia let go instantly, the moment she registered what her own hand had done, and stepped back so fast she nearly lost her own footing. Victoria staggered, caught herself against a nearby table, and the ballroom finally exhaled into a low roar of gasps and whispers. I'm so sorry, Sophia said, her voice cracking now, all the composure from moments earlier gone. Her hands were trembling, not from adrenaline, but from something far older. I didn't mean to, it was instinct, I wasn't thinking, I would never. But her mind wasn't really in the ballroom anymore. It was 6 years in the past, in a hospital corridor lit by fluorescent lights, where a doctor with tired eyes had told a 19-year-old girl that her father wasn't going to wake up. Miguel Reyes had used that exact same movement, a catch, a redirect, controlled and precise, on the last night of his life. He'd stepped between a stranger and a man with a knife outside a subway station in Astoria, disarmed the attacker in under 2 seconds without throwing a single punch, and then collapsed 20 minutes later from a stab wound none of the witnesses even realized he'd taken, because he never let his face show pain until it was already too late to matter. He died 2 days later. Sophia had been at his bedside, holding the same rough, calloused hand that had spent a decade teaching her control. His last real words to her had been quiet, almost apologetic. I only ever wanted you to be safe. Not this. Never for this. She had promised him, in that sterile hospital room, that she would never use what he taught her again. Not because the skill was dangerous. Because of what it had cost. For 6 years, she'd kept that promise. She'd swallowed insults, backed away from confrontations, made herself smaller in 100 rooms exactly like this one, because the alternative, letting her body remember, felt like betraying the last thing her father ever asked of her. And now, in front of 300 strangers and a wall of phone cameras, she had broken it in half a second, without even choosing to. Someone needs to explain what that was, a man near the bar said loudly, phone still raised, and the words rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in water. What was that? Did you see that? Who is she? The hotel's events manager, a sharp-faced woman named Diane Castellano, was already crossing the floor at a fast walk, her expression somewhere between panic and fury. Miss Reyes. My office. Now. Sophia nodded, numb, and turned to go, her eyes down, her hands still shaking. She never noticed the man standing near the far wall who had gone completely, utterly still. Alexander Ashford wasn't looking at his fiancée sprawled against the table, humiliated in front of his guests. He was staring at Sophia's retreating back with an expression none of his friends had ever seen on his face before, the look of a man who has just watched a ghost walk across the room. Because he had seen that exact movement before. Once. 6 years ago. On a subway platform in Astoria, in the 2 seconds before a stranger saved his life and then disappeared into an ambulance, and Alexander never learned his name. Alexander Ashford had spent 6 years looking for a face he could barely remember, and he had just watched that same face's daughter get fired in front of 300 people. He moved through the crowd like a man underwater, every step feeling slower than it should, his mind refusing to catch up with what his eyes had just told him. Around him, the party had fractured into a dozen whispered conversations. Victoria was being fussed over by two bridesmaids near the bar, and somewhere behind a service door, a young woman he'd never spoken to in his life was being marched toward a termination she hadn't earned. Alexander didn't go to Victoria first. That, more than anything, would matter later. He caught up to Diane Castellano just outside the ballroom side entrance, her hand already on Sophia's elbow, steering her toward the staff corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fired people before and hated it every time. "Diane," Alexander said, and something in his voice made both women stop. "Mr. Ashford, I am so sorry about this. We're handling it," Diane said quickly. "Miss Reyes will be terminated effective immediately, and I'll personally see to it that Ms. Lane's dress is." "What's your name?" Alexander asked, ignoring Diane entirely, looking at Sophia for what felt, to him, like the first time all night. Sophia blinked, thrown off by the question, by the fact that the groom himself was speaking to her at all. "Sophia," she said carefully. "Sophia Reyes." "Reyes." Something cold and electric moved down Alexander's spine. It could have been a coincidence, Reyes was not a rare name. But the movement, the exact economy of that motion, the way she'd caught Victoria's ankle without a wasted inch of effort, that wasn't a coincidence. That was muscle memory built by years of deliberate teaching, and Alexander had seen it exactly once in his life, from a man he never got the chance to thank. "Your father," Alexander said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Did your father teach you that? What you just did?" Sophia went very still. "My father passed away 6 years ago." "Miguel," Alexander said, not as a question. The color drained from Sophia's face so fast that Diane instinctively reached out to steady her. "How do you know that name?" Sophia whispered. Alexander opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had no idea how to say what needed to be said in the middle of a hallway, at his own engagement party, with his fiancée 30 feet away nursing a bruised ego and a room full of guests waiting for him to come back and smooth everything over. "I need to talk to you," he said instead. "Not here. Not tonight. But soon. Please, don't let her fire you. Take the next few days off, paid, and I will find you, I promise you that. There's something you need to know about your father, and it's not something I can say standing in a hallway." "Mr. Ashford," Diane cut in, bewildered. "With respect, Ms. Lane has specifically requested." "I'm aware of what Ms. Lane requested," Alexander said, and something in his tone closed the conversation entirely. "Sophia keeps her job. That's not a discussion." He walked away before either woman could respond, back toward the ballroom, back toward the version of his life that had, until 11 minutes ago, felt completely settled. A beautiful fiancé, a beautiful hotel, a beautiful evening built on a foundation he was only now beginning to realize might be far less solid than he'd believed. Behind him, Sophia stood frozen in the corridor, her heart hammering, one single sentence echoing through her mind on a loop. "There's something you need to know about your father." 6 years of grief, 6 years of unanswered questions about the exact final moments of her father's life. The police report had been vague. The witnesses had scattered before anyone could take real statements, and all Sophia had ever really known was that her father died a hero on a subway platform for a stranger who never came forward. She had always wondered who that stranger was. She had always wondered if he even remembered. She had no idea he was about to become the most powerful man in her entire story. By the time Sophia got home that night, her hands still hadn't stopped shaking, and she had no idea it was about to be the last quiet night her family would have for a while. The apartment above the laundromat had changed landlords twice since her father died, and the rent had climbed each time, but the walls still smelled faintly of fabric softener from the machines below, a smell that had wrapped around her entire childhood so completely that she barely noticed it anymore. Her mother, Elena, was asleep in the front room, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital where she worked as a home health aide. Her brother Matteo, 12 years old and stubborn about staying up too late, was still awake on the couch, phone in hand, the blue light of the screen washing over his face. "You're home early," Matteo said, not looking up. Then he looked up, took one glance at his sister's face, and sat up straight. "Sophia, what happened?" She almost lied. She almost said nothing, just a long shift, the way she always did, because that was the deal she'd made with herself years ago. Protect them from the parts of her life that hurt, carry the weight alone so they never had to feel it too. But her hands were still trembling, and Matteo was 12, not 5, and he was looking at her with an expression that told her he already knew something was wrong. "I did something at work tonight," she said slowly, sitting down beside him. "Something I haven't done in a long time." She told him the whole story, quietly, so as not to wake their mother. The champagne, the humiliation, the kick, the way her body had simply known what to do before her mind had a chance to object. Matteo listened with wide eyes, the way he always did when Sophia talked, even a little, about their father. "You mean like Papa's stuff? The fighting stuff he used to show you in the alley?" "I promised him I'd never use it," Sophia said, and her voice cracked on the word promised. "I promised him in the hospital. And tonight I broke that promise in front of 300 strangers with their phones out." Matteo was quiet for a moment. 12 years old but sharper than most adults Sophia knew. "Papa didn't teach you that stuff so you'd never use it, Soph. He taught it to you so you'd never be scared. There's a difference." Sophia didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't had an answer for it in 6 years. What she didn't tell Matteo, because she barely understood it herself, was the second half of that night. The strange, urgent look on Alexander Ashford's face when he'd said their father's name like he already knew it. The promise, delivered in a rushed, shaking voice, that there was something she needed to know. She lay awake most of that night turning the sentence over and over. "There's something you need to know about your father." What could a billionaire hotelier possibly know about Miguel Reyes, a man who spent his life fixing washing machines and teaching self-defense out of an alley for free to any kid in the neighborhood who needed it? Unless it had something to do with the night he died. The police file had always felt incomplete to Sophia, a stabbing outside a subway station, an attacker who fled and was never caught, a stranger her father had apparently defended who vanished before police arrived and was never publicly identified. For 6 years, that stranger had existed in Sophia's mind as a ghost, someone she resented and mourned in equal measure, someone who let her father bleed out defending him and then disappeared into the night without so much as leaving a name. She had never once imagined that Ghost might be one of the wealthiest men in New York City, standing in a hotel corridor calling her by her father's first name. 2 days passed with no word. Sophia went back to work on the third day, quietly, keeping her head down, half convinced the whole conversation had been some strange, adrenaline-fueled misunderstanding that Alexander Ashford had already forgotten, back in his real life, surrounded by people far more important than a housekeeper from Queens. She was wrong. On the 4th day, Diane Castellano found her folding towels in a supply closet on the 9th floor, her face unreadable. "Sophia, Mr. Ashford is downstairs. He's asking for you specifically. He says it's important." What Alexander Ashford had spent 4 days confirming was going to change both their lives, and neither of them was ready for it. The truth was, Alexander hadn't slept properly since the night of the engagement party. He'd gone through the motions of the following days, meetings, a strained conversation with Victoria about the incident, which he'd deflected more sharply than he meant to. But underneath all of it, one memory kept surfacing, sharper each time, a memory he'd spent 6 years trying not to think about because thinking about it meant remembering how afraid he'd been, and how he'd never had the courage to find the man who saved him. He'd been 24, 3 years into working for his father's company, walking home late from a meeting through a part of Astoria he didn't know well. A man had come at him near the subway entrance, quick, aggressive, a knife flashing under the streetlight, and Alexander remembered, even now, the specific terror of realizing he had no idea how to protect himself. And then a stranger stepped between them. It happened fast. Alexander remembered a controlled, almost gentle-looking movement, the attacker's knife arm redirected, the man disarmed in under 2 seconds without a single wasted motion. He remembered the stranger telling him, calmly, to go, to get somewhere safe, to call the police. He remembered running 2 blocks before his legs gave out and he finally called 911 with shaking hands. By the time police and an ambulance arrived, the stranger, the man who'd saved his life, was already being loaded into the ambulance himself, pale, clutching his side, refusing to give his name to the officer taking notes. Alexander had tried, in the chaos of that night, to follow up. He'd called the precinct twice in the following week, asking about the man from the incident report, but between his own family's instinct for privacy, no press, no complications, no story that made an Ashford look vulnerable, and his own cowardice, if he was honest with himself, he'd let it go. He told himself the man had survived. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility to chase down a stranger who clearly didn't want to be found. It took him 4 days and a private investigator to learn the truth he should have learned 6 years ago. Miguel Reyes had died 2 days after that incident, in a hospital less than 3 miles from where Alexander lived, from complications related to a stab wound he never told the responding officers he had, because he'd been more concerned with getting a frightened young stranger to safety than with his own injury. He left behind a wife and 2 children. The case had gone cold within weeks, no camera footage, no cooperating witnesses, an attacker never identified. Alexander sat in his office that evening with the investigator's file open on his desk, a single photograph paperclipped to the front page. Miguel Reyes, smiling, standing outside a laundromat with his arm around a teenage girl who Alexander now recognized instantly, 6 years younger, missing the exhaustion that had settled into her eyes since. He put his head in his hands and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he cried. The guilt wasn't just about the years of silence. It was about what came after, the fact that somewhere out there, a family had spent 6 years grieving a man who died anonymously, protecting a stranger who never had the decency to say thank you, and that stranger had grown up to become the kind of man who let his fiancée belittle that same family's daughter in a ballroom without saying a word until it was almost too late. He thought of Victoria's voice in that corridor, someone like you, this hotel means everything to my future husband, and something shifted in his chest, cold and final. He owed Sophia Reyes more than an apology. He owed her the truth, and whatever came after the truth, whether or not it cost him anything else in his life. The next morning, he asked Diane to bring Sophia to his office, and he sat behind his desk rehearsing the words for 20 minutes before she walked through the door, and none of them felt like enough. Some conversations change a person's entire understanding of their own life, and this was about to be one of those conversations for both of them. Sophia stood in the doorway of Alexander Ashford's office on the top floor of the Ashford Grand, twisting the hem of her uniform sleeve between her fingers, unsure whether she was about to be fired or offered an apology or something else entirely that she hadn't imagined yet. The office was quiet, warm, full of soft afternoon light, nothing like the ballroom 4 nights earlier. Alexander stood when she entered, which surprised her. In 6 years of hotel work, she'd learned that men like him rarely stood for anyone. "Please, sit," he said, and his voice had none of the polished, easy confidence she'd seen him use with guests. It sounded rough. Uncertain. "Sophia, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything, because if I stop, I don't think I'll be able to start again." She sat, her heart already pounding, some instinct telling her this was the moment everything would change. He told her everything. The subway platform in Astoria. The knife. The stranger who stepped between him and a man who wanted to hurt him, who moved with a precision Alexander had never forgotten even though he'd tried, for years, to convince himself he had. He told her about the ambulance, about the man refusing to give his name, about the 2 phone calls to the precinct that went nowhere, about the years of quiet, cowardly avoidance that followed, where it was simply easier to move forward with his life than confront the fact that a stranger had bled for him and he'd never even learned his name. He told her about the private investigator, and the file, and the photograph of a man smiling outside a laundromat with his arm around a teenage girl. Sophia sat perfectly still through all of it, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, and by the time Alexander finished, tears were sliding silently down her face, though she made no sound at all. "He never told us," she whispered finally. "The police said a witness intervened, but they never had a name, never had anything. We didn't know who he saved. We didn't know if that person even knew my father had died." Her voice cracked. "For 6 years, I wondered if the man he saved even remembered him. If he ever thought about the fact that someone bled to death protecting him and never even said thank you. I thought about it every single day," Alexander said quietly. "I just didn't have the courage to find out what happened to him. I told myself it was out of my hands. That's not true. I was afraid of what I'd find, and afraid of what it would mean about the kind of man I was for not looking sooner." Sophia wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so raw and unguarded that Alexander felt something in his chest twist painfully. "He always told me," she said, "that the whole point of what he taught me wasn't the fighting. It was making sure nobody ever had to feel as helpless as he felt, growing up. He grew up in a rough part of Manila with nothing. He said strength wasn't about being feared. It was about making sure the people around you never had to be afraid." "He succeeded," Alexander said. "I've thought about that night for 6 years. I've never told anyone the full truth of how afraid I was, or how much I owe a man whose name I only just learned 4 days ago." There was a long silence between them, heavy but not uncomfortable, the particular silence that settles after a truth finally gets spoken out loud after years of being buried. "I want to make this right," Alexander said finally. "Not with money, though I intend to make sure your family never struggles again. I mean properly right. I want people to know who your father was. I want the city to know what kind of man died anonymously protecting a stranger, because right now, 6 years later, almost nobody does. And I never want another person who works in this hotel, or any hotel I have anything to do with, to be treated the way you were treated 4 nights ago." Sophia looked at him, still crying, but something had shifted in her expression. Grief, yes, but something else moving underneath it now. Something that looked, for the first time in a long while, almost like relief. "There's something else," Alexander said, more quietly now. "Victoria asked me, twice this week, to make sure you were let go quietly, before this became a story that embarrassed the family. I want you to know I refused both times. But I think that tells you something important about who I almost married, and I don't think I can know it now." What happened over the following 2 weeks would end up on the front page of 3 different newspapers, and none of it would have happened if Alexander Ashford hadn't finally decided to stop protecting his own comfort. He didn't call off the engagement immediately, not out of hesitation, but because he wanted to be certain, wanted to give Victoria every fair chance to be the person he'd once believed she was. But the cracks, once he started looking for them, were everywhere. He remembered, with new clarity, the small cruelties he'd excused over 2 years together, the way she spoke to waitstaff, the way she'd once laughed at a homeless man outside their building, the way she'd asked him, more than once, to distance himself from his mother's old friends because they weren't useful anymore. The final conversation happened quietly, in his office, without an audience. Victoria didn't cry, didn't plead. She told him, with a coldness that confirmed everything he now understood, that he was making a mistake trading a beneficial marriage for some sentimental attachment to hired help. That sentence, more than anything else, ended things for good. The public part of the story, the part that reached newspapers, started with Alexander himself. He requested a meeting with a respected city reporter and told her the entire truth. The subway platform, the 6 years of silence, the discovery of Miguel Reyes's identity, and his decision to establish something in Miguel's name. The Miguel Reyes Community Safety Foundation opened its doors in a renovated building 2 blocks from the old laundromat less than 2 months later, offering free self-defense classes to anyone in the neighborhood who wanted them, taught by instructors handpicked and personally trained by Sophia herself, who left her housekeeping position to run the foundation full-time at a salary that finally let her mother stop working double shifts. Word spread fast. The way stories about quiet heroism tend to when someone finally tells them. Neighbors who remembered Miguel from years of free lessons in that cracked alley came forward with their own stories of his kindness. A local news segment aired his photograph, the same one from the investigator's file, smiling outside the laundromat with his arm around his daughter. For the first time in 6 years, Miguel Reyes wasn't a cold case footnote. He was a name people said out loud, with respect, in the neighborhood he'd spent his whole life trying to protect. Sophia stood at the ribbon cutting for the foundation with her mother on one side and Mateo on the other, wearing not a uniform this time but a simple navy dress her mother had insisted on buying her, and when she looked out at the small crowd that had gathered, neighbors, former students of her father's, a few hotel co-workers who'd taken the day off to come support her, she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 6 long years. She caught Alexander's eye across the crowd. He nodded once, quietly, without making a show of it, and stepped back to let the moment belong entirely to her family. That evening, after the reporters left and the small crowd dispersed, Sophia found herself back in the alley behind the old laundromat, the same cracked concrete, the same flickering security light, now much dimmer with age. She stood in the center of it, the way her father used to stand across from her, feet planted, weight even. For the first time in 6 years, she moved through the old forms, slow, deliberate, controlled, not out of fear, not out of instinct triggered by someone else's cruelty, but by choice. Every motion felt like a conversation with a man who could no longer answer, and every motion felt, finally, like healing instead of grief. 6 months after the engagement party that changed everything, the Miguel Reyes Community Safety Foundation had taught free self-defense classes to over 400 people in the neighborhood, and Sophia Reyes had become something she never once imagined she'd be. A name people recognized, a woman strangers stopped on the street to thank for classes that had made their daughters, their mothers, their grandmothers feel safe walking home at night. She still didn't think of herself as anything special. That was, more than anything, the thing that made people trust her. Alexander visited the foundation often, not as a donor swooping in for photo opportunities, but quietly, usually in the evenings after his own long workdays, sometimes just to watch a class, sometimes to help fold mats or stack chairs afterward. Neither of them rushed anything. There was too much grief and too much history tangled up in how they'd found each other for either of them to pretend a fast romance made sense. But something steady had grown between them anyway, built slowly, out of respect rather than spectacle. The opposite, in every way, of the relationship Alexander had almost married into. The turning point, the moment the whole story reached the ending most people watching from home would remember, came on the 1-year anniversary of Miguel Reyes's death. Sophia organized a small community memorial in the same alley where her father had taught his first free lesson decades earlier. Neighbors came. Former students, now grown, brought their own children. Alexander came too, standing quietly near the back, letting the evening belong to the community his private guilt had once kept him from ever properly finding. Sophia stood in the center of the gathered crowd, in the same spot she used to stand across from her father, and she spoke without notes, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been 6 years earlier. "My father used to tell me that real strength isn't about being feared," she said. "It's about making sure the people around you never have to be afraid." He lived that every single day of his life, and in the end, he died living it too. For a stranger he never even stopped to think twice about helping. Her eyes found Alexander's across the small crowd, and she offered him a small, forgiving smile. "I used to be angry at that stranger. I don't think I ever really let go of that anger until I understood the whole story. Now I understand my father wouldn't have wanted anything different. He would have done the exact same thing again, every single time, no matter the cost." The crowd was silent, moved, several people wiping their eyes. "I spent 6 years thinking the kindest thing I could do for his memory was to bury the part of myself he trained," she continued. "I was wrong. The kindest thing I can do is make sure that part of me, the part that protects people, the part that refuses to let anyone feel small or afraid, never goes quiet again." She looked around at the faces gathered in that narrow, cracked alley, Neighbors, students, her mother, her brother, a billionaire hotelier standing humbly near the back of a crowd that had once been invisible to men exactly like him, and she felt, for the first time since the hospital corridor 6 years ago, completely at peace with the promise she'd broken and the one she'd finally kept instead. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's this. You never really know what someone has survived, what they've buried, or what quiet strength they're carrying beneath a uniform, a name tag, or a job title that makes the world assume they don't matter. Sofia Reyes spent 6 years making herself smaller so the people around her would never see what her father gave her. Not because she was weak, but because grief convinced her, wrongly, that his gift had cost him everything. It took one ugly, thoughtless moment in a ballroom full of strangers to remind her that the opposite was true. Her father's greatest gift was never the ability to fight. It was the ability to protect, to refuse cruelty, to stand tall even when the whole world tried to convince you that you were furniture in someone else's story. Alexander Ashford spent 6 years running from a debt he owed a man he never had the courage to find, and it took watching that man's daughter humiliated in his own home before he finally understood that comfort and cowardice so often wear the exact same disguise. What he did with that guilt, turning it into something that helped hundreds of strangers feel safe walking home at night, is the kind of redemption that matters far more than any apology ever could. And Victoria Lane, who once stood in a glittering ballroom and told a housekeeper she didn't belong in the room, learned, in the end, exactly what kind of person that moment revealed her to be. Sometimes the most important twist in a story isn't what a hero becomes. It's what a comfortable, careless cruelty finally exposes in someone who thought no one was paying attention. That's the lesson worth carrying with you tonight. The person clearing your table, cleaning your room, carrying your bags, standing quietly in the corner of a room you consider yours, they are never just background. Every single one of them is carrying a story you know nothing about, a history that deserves more respect than the world usually gives it, and sometimes, a strength you would never expect until the moment it's finally needed. Be kind to the people the world overlooks. You never know whose daughter, whose son, whose quiet act of grace you're standing in front of. If this story moved you tonight, if it made you think even for a second about the people you might be overlooking in your own life, do me a favor, hit that like button, it truly helps this channel more than you know. Subscribe if you're new here, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week, real, emotional, unforgettable. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like Sofia's today, someone who needs a reminder that kindness and quiet strength always win in the end, please share this with them. Thank you for staying until the very end with me tonight. I'll see you in the next story.